This lesson explains how to use the last of the 4 basic trace types, perimeter traces. It builds on the lessons explaining count, length, and area traces, so be sure to watch those if you haven't already. After viewing this lesson, you'll know how to use perimeter traces to take off drawing measurements, and you'll understand the difference between perimeter and length measurements. By now, you're pretty familiar with how to initiate a trace, either by double-clicking it in the trace list or by clicking a button in the toolbar. Recall that my list of traces might be different than yours. As with the other CLAP traces, the tooltip explains the shortcut keys, and these are the same for perimeter as for the other types. By now you know how to find this assistance, so I won't keep displaying it. A perimeter trace returns the linear length between clicks, very similar to length traces. As I click the corners of a room, my values appear in the quantity list. But notice that for this first line, the length is 12.01, whereas the perimeter is 24.02. That's because with a perimeter trace, dimension always finishes the measurement with a line back to the first point. With just 2 points, the perimeter is 2 times the length. When I click the third point, you see the completion line, just as with an area trace. Dimension always closes area and perimeter traces, and it includes the length of the completion line in its perimeter value. Length values don't include the completion line. I'll end the measurement by double-clicking the lower left corner. I don't need to repeat the click at the top left for an accurate perimeter measurement. So let's quickly compare what happens with a length trace. If I trace room SK307 and stop at the lower left point, as I did with the perimeter trace, the final line is not added. The value for the perimeter does still reflect that additional line as if it were there. Now that we're accumulating more measurements, let's talk about multi-select. If I need to complete an action on more than one measurement at once, I can use multi-select. For example, these length measurements aren't accurate, so I want to delete them. I'll click multi-select, click both length traces, and press delete. In multi-select mode, I can also just click and drag to select all measurements within a specific area. To return to normal select mode, I'll click Select. So now you've learned how to use all 4 of the CLAP traces: count, length, area, and perimeter. Let's quickly review what you've learned in the last 4 lessons. The activity handout for this lesson includes a summary of what I'm about to show, so you can refer to it whenever you need to. The trace list tree control shows you a list of all the standard traces, and your list might look different than mine. We'll cover how to use the standard traces in the next lesson, so be sure to check it out. Before you can complete any measurements on a drawing, you'll need to set its scale. When I double-click a trace, the Select Scale window pops up if a scale hasn't already been set. For a count trace, I simply click each object that I'm counting. The values, in this case just the number of points, accumulates in the quantity list. I'll press S to finish this trace, and then I'll press D to give it a description. Remember that the tooltips remind you of all of the keyboard shortcuts you can use with traces. A length trace measures the distance between my clicks. I can press and hold the Control key to engage polar mode, which forces my clicks into horizontal or vertical alignment. Polar mode can enforce other angles, which you configure in user preferences. To take off irregular shapes with curved portions, use the 3 clicks plus the C button to create smooth arcs. If you need more review of this technique, you can rewatch the lesson on area traces. The point buttons give you special functionality with length, area, and perimeter traces. 2-point lines are great for non-intersecting or parallel lines, such as the parking stripes. I'll press 2 to activate 2-point line mode, and then I'll simply click the start and end point of each line. To leave 2-point line mode, I'll press 2 again to toggle it off, and then I'll press G to start a new group of points. I'll press 2 again to restart 2-point line mode. Remember, I'm just reviewing the steps that we've covered in the previous 4 lessons, so don't get discouraged, but make a note of the keyboard shortcuts that you'll use frequently. If you can memorize those shortcuts, your time with Takeoff will get faster and faster. Remember that 1-point lines let you measure a series of lines originating from the same point, such as you often see on electrical plans. As you complete any measurement, you can press H to turn crosshairs on or off. Crosshairs are these vertical and horizontal lines extending away from the cursor to help you align clicks. When taking an area measurement, clicking in a counterclockwise direction gives you a negative quantity. You can use this method to cut out or exclude portions of the measurement. Finally, remember that you can configure several options in Settings, User Preferences. On the Drawing tab, the Degrees Between Arc Points setting determines the sample size when you measure arcs and circles using the 1, 2, 3, C technique. The lower this value, the greater number of points in the curve and the more accurate your measurement. The crosshair display options let you change the width and the color of crosshairs. You can always toggle crosshairs on or off using the H key, or you can set it here and then leave it. The polar mode snap angles give you options for how you want lines to snap when using polar mode. This lesson showed you how to use perimeter traces, and we talked about the difference between length and perimeter measurements. We also reviewed what we covered in the 4 lessons using the basic clap traces. Our review went pretty quickly, so remember that you can find a summary of what was covered in the activity handout. Before you move on to the next lesson, take a couple of minutes to complete the activities in the handout. You want to get really proficient at using traces of all 4 types. Thanks for viewing this Anytime Learning lesson.